Here we go, and this should, as I said, really be something. Grant Jeffrey is internationally recognized as a leading author writing about Bible prophecy, apologetics, privacy, and technology issues. His research in prophecy as well as apologetics has been recognized by numerous authorities and authors. More than 4 million readers have read Grant's 17 best-selling books, 17, as well as many who've enjoyed his videos and audio tapes during the last 13 years. Very well read in the area that he's going to, well written, I guess I should say, in the area he's going to speak. Mike Heiser, you probably know, he's been on the program before. He's currently writing his PhD dissertation in Hebrew Bible and Ancient Semitic Languages at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Holds an MA in Ancient History from an Ivy League institution, University of Pennsylvania, major fields, Ancient Israel and Egyptology. I think you get the picture. Again, Mike Heiser is author of the Bible Code Myth. Grant Jeffrey is one of the world's leading authorities on the Bible Code. And I thought it appropriate, well, first of all, gentlemen, good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening, Art.
Okay. I thought that we'd start out with Grant, and I don't know why I think this, except that I don't know a lot about either one of your professional endeavors, gentlemen. I don't know a lot about the Bible Code, and so, Grant, it made sense to me that we would start with you, if that's all right.
Certainly.
Can you tell us, Grant, give us Bible Code 101. What is the Bible Code?
Okay. First of all, the Bible Code is something that I heard about 10 years ago in Israel during the trip that some Israeli mathematicians at Hebrew University were analyzing the Hebrew text of the Old Testament.
Right.
And they had discovered a fascinating phenomena of equidistant letter sequence where they would find particular, meaningful, in their mind, Hebrew words spelled out by skipping, let's say, every 25 letters, every 50 letters, maybe every 7 letters.
Right.
And they applied computer programs and statistical analysis and convinced themselves that in fact, this was not accidental. But it goes really much, much further back. All the way back to the Zohar 2,000 years ago, there are references that Jewish rabbis believed that there was something strange about the text, especially of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament.
Yes.
They believed that God had somehow placed key words related to future events within the text of the Torah.
Said another way, a secret code from God.
Right. Let's imagine a spy. He has to send a secret message to his commander.
Right.
He writes the letter to his wife, but the commander, when he gets the letter, knows that by prearrangement he's going to circle every 12th letter, and then he finds the secret message that there are 20 cannon in the fort and 500 soldiers. This type of code has been used throughout history. Simply by skipping an equal number of letters, you find the hidden code words. Way back, about 600 years ago, a Rabbi Bakia was examining the Hebrew text of the Old Testament, and he discovered that there were things that were quite strange to him. For example, beginning with the first letters and words of the book of Genesis, he found the word Torah spelled out at a 50-letter interval. He discovered many other codes.
Once or twice or 10 times or what?
Well, once at the beginning of Genesis and Exodus, and then in Numbers and Deuteronomy, he found it spelled in reverse every 50 letters. When the sort of rumors or legends of this began to develop and were written and discussed in the Talmud, this really remained something that only a few of the rabbis were aware of. But when computers were developed, the Israeli scientists were able to test this. They were able to analyze the entire text of the Old Testament, the Tanakh as the Jews would call it, by putting in an electronic text into the computer and basically trying various assumptions, various skip distances. What has happened in the code research that's been done in the last 10 years is there's really 2 types. One is done by mathematicians and scientists, statisticians using computers, analyzing, looking for statistical significance that cannot be explained by random chance.
Mm-hmm.
The other type of code research that has been done by many people like Yaakov Ramsel and myself has been done sometimes in the case of my friend Yaakov Ramsel, actually manually, just looking at the text and counting off the letters, looking at a very specific text that is of interest to us. For example, Isaiah 53 is a very famous prophecy that Christians have believed is a prophecy 700 years before Jesus was born that clearly predicts the life, the trial, and the death of Jesus of Nazareth. And even Jewish scholars admit, many of them, that it is a messianic prophecy, although they would, of course, not believe it points to Jesus.
Okay, well, let's take this as an example. When the code is found, what does the code tell us, and how many times does it say it?
Well, in Isaiah 53, what is most remarkable is you would expect in any sufficiently large text to find accidental ELSs, like the word bat, tree, small words. If you skip it, if you try enough possibilities in any large text,
100 monkeys,
you're going to find. But what was found here is in a passage which specifically relates to the Messiah. My friend Yaakov Ramsel and I were able to discover that there were 41 specific names naming the individuals who were at the cross, the disciples of Jesus, three Marys, Pilate, King Herod, the name Yeshua, Yeshua is my name, 41 names. Now, it's obvious that if you only look for 2 or 3 names, or if you only found 2 or 3 names, in any large text, if you allow yourself to skip a large enough number of letters, you are going to find accidental words that are just simply accidental, ELSs. They're not meaningful.
Sure.
But here we had a passage that begins in Isaiah 52, in the last couple of verses, and goes for 15 sentences, a very small portion of the Bible. And in that specific passage that dealt with the Messiah, here we find 41 names naming all these individuals and places connected with the event that was 700 years in the future. I have challenged on the Internet, I've challenged in my books, for those who believe as researchers that this is accidental, that it's not meaningful, to find any other language, any other passage of literature, to find 15 sentences within which they can find 41 names about any other historical event. No one's been able to do that. You can find things like the word Somoza, the president of Nicaragua who was assassinated.
Yes.
You can find his name if you skip a large enough number of letters. And what you won't find, though, is what you find in the Bible codes, where you find a cluster with fairly low skip distances, say less than 100, many of them are less than 30 letters skipped, and a whole cluster of dozens, all together, all about one event. That's what we have never seen anyone demonstrate. I think the best attempt that's been done is that a group of 7 words, very short words, about Hanukkah was discovered in a random piece of literature outside the Bible.
All right. With respect to Isaiah 52, and you said 41 names, right?
Yes, Isaiah 52.
Of people who were there at the crucifixion.
Yes.
Now, computers are good for everything else, including trying to find this code. What are the odds of? I wonder if you know what the odds are of being able to find this many names, 41 names, of people who were present at the crucifixion in that much language. What are the odds of that?
Well, I've been told by mathematicians that they're quite staggering.
How staggering?
Well, they're talking in the billions.
Billions to one.
But it's more than that, because if you're just dealing with a short word, especially if it's of 4, 5 letters, you're more likely by accident to find that. The question is, why would you find so many words, all related historically to the events surrounding the cross, in one specific place? But some of the researchers have recently discovered that there's actually some tests they've run where they found a particular one that says, Yeshua is my name, and it goes, they've extended the code even further and discovered an actual long sentence that they say statistically, and again, I'm not a mathematician, but several of the mathematicians in a site on the Internet called Bible Code Digest have made mathematical and statistical claims that are quite astonishing in the unlikelihood that these things could happen by random chance.
May I ask this, Grant? It's what everybody asks. Why would God write a code to us? What is the point? The Bible seems very direct in every way, in every instruction and lesson. So why would God write a code? What's the point?
Well, I think if the Bible code phenomena is real, and obviously many ELSs will simply be accidental, but if we do determine that these particular ELSs are purposeful and cannot be accounted for by random chance,
right,
I think the reason would be that God knew that this generation would be perhaps the most skeptical, scientifically minded generation in history. We would have computers.
That's us.
And that this Bible code would demonstrate one thing and one thing only. It would demonstrate the supernatural origin of the Bible, because how could anyone, centuries and centuries before it happened, know the names of the disciples and all those people who were there at the cross, or in the case of Bible codes that dealt with Hitler, Eichmann, and the names of death camps like Auschwitz, those kind of things. And there are literally hundreds of examples of clusters of codes.
To serve up the authenticity. It makes sense. In other words, 2,000 years passed since his representative was here, and it would make sense that, the people that, of course, were alive then, they have no problem believing, but after a couple of thousand years have gone by, a little bit of doubt creeps in. People get pretty cynical. It's the modern technological world, and so here's a way of delivering the message to the new modern technological world. The Bible code.
Let me give you three cautions that I preface my book with, and I really believe we need to keep these in mind, because many people imagine that the Bible codes actually are a message in and of itself. In other words, they imagine that the Bible codes spell out sentences which might contain doctrine or messages, etc.
Yes.
What we find are individual words like Hitler and Eichmann and Auschwitz, not sentences.
Right.
So, first caution, there are no secret messages in the Bible codes. God's message to mankind, I believe, is the surface written text of the Bible plus nothing.
The message is, it's real.
That's right. Second, the Bible codes cannot be used to enable you to become a prophet and predict future events.
Right.
And let me explain why this is so. Because there are no sentences, but rather we find words like Hitler and Eichmann and Auschwitz. If we went back in time, and let's say we knew about the Bible code back in 1920, you couldn't find Hitler and Eichmann and Auschwitz because you wouldn't know what to look for.
So it automatically applies to things
that have already
happened, right?
So, and God forbids fortune telling, and so this is consistent with that. And Michael Drosden
has anybody gone through and looked for Antichrist?
I believe so, but again, it would not help you know anything, because one of random accidental ELSs that would spell out the name, Tom, Bill, at any place would mean nothing. The fact is, only after the fact could you interpret it to know what it meant. If you found the word Hitler back in 1920, you would have no idea whether it was meaningful.
Sure.
Only the event proves that it's meaningful. And last caution of the three, this has nothing to do with numerology. Numerology is an occult science in which people imagine that because of the value of your name adds up to the number 9, that has something to do with your future. It's irrelevant in the Bible codes whether we skip 5 letters or 27. It's just that it's an equal skip distance that results in, hopefully, a meaningful word that is then clustered with other meaningful words within a paragraph or two, not that it's stretched out by skipping thousands of letters or even hundreds and hundreds of letters, because that's much more likely to be statistically accidental.
Grant, is there any doubt in your mind, personally, that the Bible code is true? That it really is a fact?
I believe that there are Bible codes that are purposeful and significant. There are lots of Bible codes, or ELSs, that people may think are significant, but probably are simply accidental. But there are some that I think are absolutely purposeful.
Okay. All right. And again, the reason is interesting as well. At this point, let's bring Mike on, and you've said quite a bit. Mike, welcome once again, and if you would, between now and the bottom of the hour, respond to what you just heard.
Okay. First of all, it was a very good introduction. I think that was very helpful. A quick question for Grant, and neither of us are statisticians, so I'm not expecting precision here. Grant, how many letter differences do you think in the Isaiah 52 and 53 passage, the 15 verses there, would make a difference, would undermine the code? What would matter? How many letter differences?
Well, it would all depend on the length of the particular words that are spelled out in code. If it's a small, let's say it's a small skip distance and it skips right over and the letter variant is simply one letter replaced by another, then that would not destroy the existence of that code word. If, on the other hand, a letter was removed, then if a particular word was spelled out by skipping over that, you would lose that word and you would never know whether it was intended to be there or not.
Right, so the important part would be letters that would be missing in the text.
Or added.
Or missing or added, and not just different letters.
Right.
Okay? And how many of those do you think would matter in those 15 verses? You know, I know we're not statisticians, but just...
No. I have seen statements on the Internet that tell us that there's, about 17 different letter variations and one actual word that the Dead Sea Scrolls, the word light, that is added to verse 11. I haven't been able to access, because my Acrobat is not working on my computer, to access your full site to see what you were claiming. But the fact of the matter is, it seems that most of the problem, well, at least certainly a part of the problem you have with the phenomena, is that when you look at some of the Dead Sea Scrolls, you find considerable textual variation from the Masoretic Text. The Masoretic Text, for our listeners, is the text that Orthodox Jews have been using for the last 1,000 years or so, and they believe it has been faithfully copied out and handed down. Enormous care was taken by the Jewish scholars down through the centuries to literally count the number of letters in the book of Genesis, count the middle letter, count the middle sentence, count up every one of the letters so that they had a control long before computers as to accuracy, and it is astonishing.
Gee whiz, one would almost imagine from listening to this, if they were counting then counting may have been critical. It may have been instructed at some point that counting was critical. And why would counting be critical?
There's something we're missing here.
What's that?
They're counting during the Middle Ages.
Yes.
Okay, this is the era of the Masoretes. This has nothing to do with the Dead Sea Scrolls. And Grant, just on the possibility that your Adobe might not work, I've posted what I'm going to be referring to in the next half hour. I've posted it in picture images. So if you want to go up and look at that, I would use Internet Explorer. But you said 17 would make a great difference.
No, I said that...
Or 17, that's what you've heard of.
Somebody had written that there were 17, and 3 of them were actually in a word light.
Right. In the next half hour, I'm going to show you 115 in 15 verses.
All right. Hold it right there, gentlemen. Jim in Santa Maria, California says, why not have Echelon go to work on the Bible code for us? They've got the proper computers. I guess that would be right. All right, gentlemen, welcome back. You both, I take it, to a large degree anyway, certainly agree on the the validity of the original text that we're talking about here, right?
We believe, I think, and are in total agreement of the inspiration of the Bible, that God inspired the writers to record precisely His intention. One of the things I'd point out, though, in this whole thing is that, for example, when you compare the Torah, the first 5 books, Genesis through Deuteronomy, there's about 304,805 Hebrew letters in the first 5 books of the Bible.
Yes.
Out of 304,805 letters, according to Dr. Jeffrey Satinover, there's only 169 letters that differ in the Dead Sea Scroll text to the Masoretic text that is used by the Orthodox Jews for the last 1,000 years, and that most of the Bible code scholars use on the computer programs as well as manually. When you compare it to the other major text, the VHS text, that is used often by Gentile scholars, there's 130 letters that differ out of the 304,805. Now, in the case of the Dead Sea Scroll variants of 169 letters, that's only one letter out of 1,803. So while the letters differ, I think Michael and I would both agree that what differs here is the spelling in these small differences, but the words themselves are not in doubt.
At any rate, you're saying that there are enough correct consecutive letters to properly be looking for a code, that there would be.
I believe so. And to the extent there was a mistake, a deletion or addition, and you might miss that particular code word or maybe several of them.
Right.
But you wouldn't destroy the phenomenon. And Dr. Jeffrey Satinover is a mathematician. He has stated this, and he said, I'll just quote, "In sum, the presence of a limited number of transmission errors will not erase the Bible code if it's really there.
It'll simply sort of cause it to hobble a little bit." Mike, what about that?
Well, with respect to Dr. Satinover, and he is a mathematician, he is not a text scholar, and he is dead wrong. The spelling differences are absolutely critical. They are not critical for meaning, and Grant and I would agree about the nature of the text, the nature of the Bible, and I'm quite sure that most of our theological positions would be the same. But this business of there only being less than 200 in the Torah simply does not account for spelling differences. It doesn't account for scribal notations of suspicious letters. These are all things that I document visually in my book, The Bible Code Myth. What Satinover is referring to are letter differences, not spelling differences, letter differences between the Masoretic Text that, that such and such group uses as opposed to another one. The Dead Sea Scrolls are not used by Bible code proponents. And I'm saying that this is the text. Everybody knows this in the world, virtually. I have to say virtually because there must be somebody out there who wouldn't. That the Dead Sea Scrolls are the most significant manuscript discovery, perhaps in the history of the world. This is the textual material that is closest to the moment of inspiration of the Bible. This is the way the scribes wrote. When you're talking about letter differences of the Masoretes and all this stuff, you're talking Middle Ages, 1,000 or more years after the Dead Sea Scrolls. And what I'm saying is that spelling matters for a code. Now, on my website, www.biblecodemyth.com, I know a lot of the audience does not have internet access, but we're going to try to play both sides of the coin here. There is a visual illustration. I go through line by line. I have on the website the actual script in the Dead Sea manuscript, so if your listeners have not seen what a Dead Sea Scroll manuscript looks like, this would be the place to go. Mm-hmm. Below that, for readability, I type out the Hebrew letters that are in the Dead Sea script, and then below that, I have the traditional Masoretic text that most people who do Bible code stuff use. And visually, I have highlighted in color. You don't have to know any Hebrew to see this. I have highlighted in color where the scribes at the Dead Sea Scroll area, Qumran, how they spelled every word. And you can visually see, and you can count. There are 115 different variations in spelling. Now, Art, one of the reasons I wanted to do this was not just for this discussion, but was for you personally. Because the last time I was on the show, I had difficulty communicating why letter differences
are important
and simultaneously do not affect meaning.
Right.
What we're talking about, for those who don't have internet access, are things like, think of British English. Which is the correct word? Color. C-O-L-O-R?
O-U-R.
Or O-U-R. Well, who cares? It doesn't mean anything in meaning, but if you need, in a manuscript, in a book, in 15 verses, in whatever, in a letter string, if you need the letters to get hits for a code, every letter matters.
Michael, can I ask a question?
The same thing.
But I think that Grant's argument was that even if there are errors,
they're not errors. They're just spelling style.
Or whatever you want to call it. Inaccuracies from what originally was intended. How about if we use that phrase? That it wouldn't destroy the Bible code. It would just perhaps cripple it a little bit. But you would see enough of the code because
not in this 15-verse sample. You take 115 letter differences in the span of only 990 letters.
Yes, but have you used a particular area with what you consider to be high error rates?
No, I just picked the passage out of his book, Isaiah 52 and 53.
Okay.
I used the 15 verses in his book.
Same stuff, all right.
Sure.
Michael, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are at least 2 and probably more copies of Isaiah, right?
Yeah, there's the Great Isaiah Scroll,
Yep,
Isaiah
complete.
A, and then B.
And are there variants between those?
Between those texts, yes. B probably favors, let me get this right. B probably favors the Septuagint a little bit more than A.
But the fact that there's a variant there between the two, doesn't that argue that what you've got is error or variation that is occurring in the Dead Sea Scrolls? Those people who translated the King James Bible, many of us from our tradition believe that God basically not only inspired the Word, but was assured it was transmitted and carried down. Not necessarily that there's not a letter wrong anywhere, but the fact that in the Dead Sea Scrolls you have variant readings when you have multiple examples of a particular passage, doesn't that argue that perhaps the Dead Sea Scrolls, while they're fantastic to confirm the basic text, that the basic meaning, and it does prove that the words have been transmitted, the message has not been lost or even altered, that in fact the variant spellings in that is not necessarily that's the one you should go with.
No, it doesn't prove that at all, because I think we're missing the point between errors as in manuscript differences.
May I ask about a difference?
Sure.
Mike.
Art, are you looking, by the way, at the...
yes, I have a question.
Sure.
Rick in Washington, Illinois, says, please let the audience know that Hebrew is read from right to left. That is correct?
Correct.
Okay. People who are going to the page, I think, should understand that.
The same scribes who copied the Great Isaiah Scroll used the same spelling conventions as the one who did Isaiah B, which is far less complete. The Great Isaiah Scroll is the one that I took the example from, and that is within the Masoretic tradition.
Well, is your contention
we're not talking about different text families. We're not talking about word disagreements between text families. We're talking about letter differences, which is crucial for the code, and I think that the Dead Sea Scrolls, particularly this example,
is your contention that in the Torah that it's also that you've got a hopeless degree of variance between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Masoretic in the Torah?
Yeah, they use the same spelling conventions. We're not talking about hopeless errors, okay? We're talking about spelling. Again, color versus, OR versus OUR. It's just a fact.
But the fact that the Bible code occurs...
Hold on one second.
No, let me interject something. If you took a British book, a contemporary British book, and its American equivalent, and throughout the book, or in special places at least, there was a code, is it not probable that there would be enough similar letters, or the similarities would be so much greater than the disparities, that if there was a code, you would see signs of the code. You could begin to verify signs of the code despite the errors?
Well, the way to apply your question is, let's say we took a British book and we did ELS sequencing to it, and then along comes a guy like me that says, wait a minute, take out all the U's from OUR endings.
Right.
And see what you get.
Right, and there would be others.
Right, every letter shifts. And here's the important part. These, 90% of the visual example I have are either things that need to go in MT or not, the Masoretic text. They're not letter exchanges, as Grant was detailing and did a very good job earlier. They are things that are just not in the letter chain of the code.
But my point is, even if you assume the worst, and we use the British book and the American book as an example, and assume the worst, with the same rate of error that we've been talking about here, you would still find areas in the book where the computer would begin to verify words.
What would happen is what Grant brought up earlier, when he said that the small letters, he admitted that the small letters can be found accidentally. And you can get that with any text of any length. The thing is here, with this example, You can't go 50 letters without a letter insertion needed or deletion.
All right.
It shifts the entire thing in only 15 verses. There's 115. If you extrapolated this out to the whole Hebrew Bible or the whole Torah, again, all we're talking about is spelling style. But if you want a code and you think it's from God, then use the text that is closest to when God inspired the text.
Well,
there's just a vast amount of letter differences. Huge.
Why would the Bible code phenomena be present? And basically, no one argues that these ELSs are not there. It's just whether they're statistically and purposely placed there, statistically significant. Okay. Why would they be there and not in the Dead Sea Scroll variant?
I would say, first of all,
couldn't it be that the Dead Sea Scroll is not the most accurate text, but in fact that the Masoretic Text does contain the truest textual tradition, which is what was believed by those who did the King James Bible.
You're making the mistake here of separating the Dead Sea Scroll text from the Masoretic Text. The Dead Sea Scroll text of Isaiah A is a member of the Masoretic family. It is a Masoretic text. Now, if you're going to make that argument that the later text, the one that's medieval, that the scribes, worked on, if you're going to make that argument, then what you're doing is you can't claim divine inspiration for a code. You have to claim medieval rabbinic inspiration for a code, and that's a separate act of inspiration. And personally, my theology doesn't allow for that. Because if we're taking if we're taking the text, the Dead Sea Scroll text, that is closest to the way it looked when it was originally written, and then we change it in the medieval period, the rabbis get to pull letters out and create the Masoretic text because now they're using little dots for vowels instead of extra consonants. If we get to do that, then we have to give the rabbis credit for this code, and they're not divine.
The King James translators, for example, were using the Masoretic text. And
they were using a Masoretic text that was medieval.
And they believed that this was the inspired Word of God, and they translated to the best of their ability into
and they were right. They were right, because meaning is preserved. They were not looking for a code.
Of course they weren't looking for a code.
Well, see, but you're dichotomizing the two.
Well, I'm just saying that.
Of course, they believe.
Let's say the Dead Sea Scrolls had never been found, Michael.
Then we would have the Bible we have.
Right. We have the Bible we have.
Okay, and we would have a Bible.
But your argument
have a Bible with a medieval rabbinic code.
Your argument is the Dead Sea Scrolls, wherever they vary from the Masoretic text, is in fact, correct, and the accurate, and then the Masoretic text is wrong.
No. Both texts are Masoretic. Okay? This is why when you read in books, and this is true, people aren't hoodwinking us, when they say the Great Isaiah Scroll agreed 98% of the time with the medieval Masoretic text.
Of course.
That's true.
Yes.
That's true. You know why? Because they're not talking about a code. They're not talking about a letter sequence. They're talking about the proper words that convey the proper meanings.
I understand.
Okay? So that is true. They're not hoodwinking their readership. Mm-hmm. But if you want to, again, say that God put a code in the text via the letters, then use the text that is closest to the act of inspiration. If you don't, you have to give the rabbis who took those consonants out and substituted little dots and dashes, the medieval vowel system. You have to give the rabbis credit for inventing the code, and they're not divine.
Mike, I have a question for you.
Sure.
And that is this. Grant said that the mathematical probabilities of finding, say, 41 names, Isaiah 52 and 53, would be billions to one.
Mm-hmm.
How do you refute that?
Well, if you insert or delete the 115 letter differences I'm talking about, the code evaporates. Now, up on my website, again, I'm not a statistician, but I have some quotations. You go up to the website, and by the way, I have to mention this, since Art, you've been so kind to have me on again, I am practically giving away the book. It's 50% off, but only to your audience and only for 2 days. And you can't get it through Amazon. You've got to go through my site.
Oh.
If you go up there, there's a toll-free number, too.
Oh, you better give that out.
Yeah, I better give it out, or the new publisher's just going to skin me alive here.
No, go ahead.
Okay, it's 1-800-243-1438. 1438. And if you go to Amazon, you're going to pay double. That's nice for me, but it's not nice for you.
Right.
Now, if you go up to the website.
The Bible Code Myth.
Right, the Bible Code Myth. All the links are there. I have some comments by a guy named Dr. Randall Ingermanson, who is a computational physicist. He's a friend that I met after the first time I was on for this topic. He has taken my Isaiah document that I'm referencing you guys to, and this is what he says. He does all the number crunching there. He says what this means, the text results in practical terms is that just about any three-letter word you could name is essentially certain to be found somewhere in this passage at some skip. Now, Grant would admit that. He talked about the accidental hits. For example, one expects to find the four-letter word Yeshua more than 6 times strictly by chance. There isn't a stretch of even 50 letters without a deletion, and that means, here, this is his term, virtually every ELS sequence in this passage, except a few short ones at small skips, are corrupt. Now, this is a computational physicist. The numbers mean nothing once you look at the condition of the text, and this is my contention in the whole book. The entire enterprise is flawed because you are working with the wrong data set, the wrong letters.
Well, how can you explain, Michael, something like the Bible code found in Isaiah 53? It's got 22 letters. It's the longest one that I know of that has ever been verified.
Hey, that's the one that begins at Isaiah 53:5.
Yeah, gushing from above, Yeshua was my mighty name, and the clouds rejoiced.
Wow.
Now, Ed Sherman, who is a mathematician, has
but not a text scholar.
No, but
there are 63 letter differences.
Excuse me,
but that doesn't matter.
Gentlemen, hold on.
It certainly does matter.
Hold on, gentlemen. Hold on.
It doesn't matter to what I'm saying right now.
Time. What was that sentence again, please?
Gushing from above, Yeshua was my mighty name, and the clouds rejoiced.
That's also on my website, too.
That's
now,
incredible.
he calculates.
All right, gentlemen, listen, we're at a break. When we come back, we'll pick up from this point. All right, here we go. Gentlemen, this is it's a pedestrian question, but I think I'll ask it. Randy in Pittsburgh, California, asks, who exactly wrote the Bible anyway?
Well, we have about 40-some individuals over a period of 1,600 years were inspired by God, Christians and Jews believe, to record these 66 different books. And so over a 1,600-year period, we have people from kings to shepherds to tax collectors, all of them individually claiming that they were inspired by God, wrote the individual books that have now been brought together as both the Old and New Testament.
But it was all individual inspiration?
Yes.
From God?
From God, we believe.
Or by that question, did you mean that the words were sort of fed into the person's head by God? Is that why you asked that?
Well, that seemed to be the essence of the answer.
Well, inspiration also involves writers using sources too. For instance, Luke in his gospel in the first 4 verses tells us, that he used source material. So it's not, something that is divorced from doing the work of a historian or a scholar or something like that. It's those things are involved too.
I'm not sure I'm satisfied I got the answer to the question. Who originally wrote the Bible?
Well, I thought Grant did a good job answering that. It wasn't
so. It was no single person.
No, it's no single person. I can tell you the modern scholarly view, which is a guess, is that around 450 BC. Roughly in the lifetime of Ezra the scribe, and a book of the Bible is named after him. He was a real historical person. Most rabbis would say that it was during Ezra's time that all the manuscript data was gathered. And when I say manuscript data, I mean the pages of the individual books, if I can use a modern term like page instead of scroll. And Ezra supervised the final editing and collation and getting it into a good readable form for posterity. So that, if you want to put somebody at the head of a process like that, that's what most scholars.
This was 500 BC?
450 BC.
450 BC.
Now the books were composed, much earlier than that, and Grant and I would some of the books were composed much earlier than that. Grant and I would certainly agree there. But as far as someone within the prophetic community saying, it's done now, and here's what we're going to go with, and here's what we want copied. When we go back to the land of Israel, they were in captivity going back. Usually people consider that person to be Ezra. And that may or may not be true. You know, it's a scholarly guess.
But it's a guess.
It's a guess as far as his work. But the actual composition of the books occurred, like Grant said, over a vast period of time, centuries.
Boy, it seems amazing to somebody like myself that the preservation in the manner that you described and all those involved, that the preservation would be anywhere near accurate enough. Now here I go tipping the other way to support the translation of a code. Well,
it is remarkable. I mean, Grant and I would agree that there, let's face it, in the ancient world there is nothing like the Bible. You look at Caesar's Gallic Wars. There's a dozen copies of that or so. If you just take New Testament, let's just leave the Old Testament out of this. You take New Testament, there's over 5,000 copies. Now that could be the whole thing, or it could be part of a book, or some scrap of a manuscript. But 5,400, 5,500 versus 11. Okay, there's just nothing like the Old and New Testament for the commitment to perpetuate the text. And the letter differences that we're talking about, when you get up to about 100 AD, there were at Qumran, there's evidence for 3 different versions of the Old Testament. And again, it's not like one guy was copying the phone book and the other guy was copying the Old Testament. I mean, they're 98% the same anyway. But you can go across the board and pick a passage, and there might be differences, 3 different kinds of differences, a word here or there. So, we have evidence for 3 sets. And so about 100 AD, the scribes get together, kind of like I wish people would do today, and say, hey, there's 150 English translations. Let's just narrow it down a little bit. And they said, let's pick a text that we want to go to. Now, that decision was motivated to a great degree by the Christian use of the Septuagint in their debates with the Jews over Christ and different things like that. The Septuagint was the Greek translation of a particular Hebrew text into Greek. But around 100 AD, the rabbis thought, hey, let's settle on one. And they settled on one that became known as the Masoretic Text,
right,
which is very, very similar to, again, Dead Sea Scroll material, a lot of it, like we're talking about. So, one's called pre-Masoretic and the other one's Masoretic, but they're all in the same family. And so from about 100 AD up through the late Middle Ages, they're copying the same text. And in the late Middle Ages, they said, hey, let's take out these letters, these consonants, because Hebrew didn't originally have vowels. So what the Hebrews were doing, and they started this about the 7th century BC, was they would use consonants to do double duty, to act as vowels in the text to preserve the correct pronunciation. And so in the Middle Ages, they said, well, let's get rid of this system. It's just kind of old and clunky, and let's put little dots and dashes in. And so they began removing these extra consonants. And that's what I'm saying is, look,
deadly.
That's deadly to the code, unless you want to give the rabbis who did that the credit for arranging the code.
Grant?
And they're not divine.
That's a pretty heavy item to overcome.
Well, if the Masoretic text that the Orthodox Jews used, well, all Jews used throughout the world, and was used primarily by those who translated the Bible, the King James Bible, for example, if it is full of errors and changes.
They're not errors. They're not errors.
Errors, variants.
Spelling, updating.
Yeah, okay. Well, some of them would be errors, too. I mean, it's not as if everything's just a spelling change.
There are manuscript disagreements. You and I both believe in inerrancy, Grant.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, let me make my point I've been trying to make for about 10 minutes.
Well, I don't think you should use the word error.
Well, let him go ahead.
Go ahead.
If the Masoretic text that the Bible Code scholars and researchers use is not the correct text, how in the world can we explain the discovery in Isaiah 53 of the longest Bible code so far of 22 letters, gushing from above, Yeshua was my mighty name, and the clouds were... Could I complete it before you rebut? The mathematician, Ed Sherman, has calculated that the chance of this 22-letter ELS appearing anywhere in the entire Old Testament is 1 chance out of 685 billion times 1 billion. That's anywhere, and they did not discover it by chance, anywhere in the whole of the Tanakh, except in Isaiah 53, which specifically is a prophecy about the Messiah. Just to put that number, 1 out of 685 billion times a billion in context, he uses the illustration that if you covered the entire continental U.S. with quarters stacked 450 feet high, and you took one of those quarters and painted it blue, and you set somebody blindfolded to go search for it, and when they think they're in the right state, the right county, they dig down as deep as they want. They'd have the same chance of finding that blue quarter as this 22-letter ELS would have of appearing anywhere in the Tanakh, the Old Testament, let alone even more unlikely that it would appear in Isaiah 53.
All right. What about the blue quarter, Mike?
The blue quarter. Okay. Well, in that example, and this is on my website as well, just look for the 22-letter notation on my website. You can go to this page that I'll be referencing. First of all, that letter sequence begins in Isaiah 53:5. And again, you can look at that on BibleCodeDigest.com if you want that code sequence. If I take Isaiah 53:5 and go to the end of Isaiah 53, there are 63 letter differences between that text and the Dead Sea Scrolls of that same passage. Now, Grant said before the break that it doesn't matter. Well, I would say if you dump 63 letters into that letter chain, you're only talking 7 verses.
The question is, why would it be there?
It matters. Oh, I'll tell you why it would be there. Okay? Why does the code, quote unquote, work? Generally, I would say the code works because it's not scientific. And here's what I mean. All right, here's an illustration. If you flip the coin 1,000 times and record the sequence, heads, tails, whatever,
right,
order they're in,
right,
the odds that you would get the particular sequence that you do when you're done are, according to mathematicians, 10 to the 300th power to 1. But you and I both know that's no miracle. Why? Because all you did was flip a coin and write down the results. Now, here's what you need for a miracle. If you predict beforehand that the 1,000 coin flips would result in that particular sequence,
then you have a miracle.
Then you've got a miracle. Now, what Bible code practitioners don't do is they don't tell us beforehand what they're going to get. They don't list the names beforehand that they're going to find. Not only that, but they don't decide on.
But according to Grant, you would never know ahead of time. He made that case rather strongly that.
But if you know
In other words,
I know who the disciples
in 1920 we would not have known
right.
the name
but
Hitler.
I know who the disciples were. Okay, I know who the disciples were. Mm-hmm. I can list the disciples' names, and I can postulate, the scientific method, a hypothesis. Here's the 12 disciples. Here's, 20 other people associated with the life of Christ. Here's the way their names were spelled, and you got to pick your language. Okay, Grant doesn't do this in his book. He doesn't pick Hebrew or Aramaic, and Aramaic was, of course, the language that was spoken during Jesus' day. He also doesn't pick Greek. That was the language of the New Testament. You got to pick a language, and let's say it's Hebrew. The other problem is the Bible code practitioners will use modern Hebrew vocabulary and count something as a hit, and then they'll turn around and use ancient Hebrew vocabulary for a hit. You got to specify what the names are, how they're spelled, what language, what stage of the language, and then eliminate the accidental hits that Grant talked about earlier, the really short ones. Try to get something, 5 letters or above, and then, finally, and here's where I come in, establish the right text, the right data set. If you can do all of that beforehand, and then out on the other end, you get what you hypothesized, that is significant. Okay, what we have is we have people feeding the Hebrew letter sequence into a computer, and then the computer spits out according to whatever, parameters you put in, and then they go looking. They don't tell you beforehand what they're going to find, and
Mike,
how it's spelled and what language.
But, Mike, even you, having said all that, looking at a sequence as relevant as the one that Grant read.
Well, I would say it's not relevant because I'm going to dump 63 letters in there and throw the whole thing apart.
Nevertheless, when you first saw it, it must have taken you aback a bit.
Well, it takes me back because it's so awkward. I mean, the first word, gushing, is the Hebrew shakak. If you look shakak up in a standard biblical Hebrew dictionary, Brown Driver Briggs is the standard. and I did a computer search for this word. It's only used in 6 verses, and it never refers to cloud activity or rain. It always refers to terrestrial activity of animals, chariots. It means rushing. Okay, so I mean, if you're going to just say, well, I got a cloud here in the sentence, and I got clouds rejoicing. Okay, that's poetic. Boy, I need something for the first word here that pertains to this parallelism here. Well, gushing. That's sort of it's the same activity as rushing. I think Bible code practitioners of this sort are guilty of forcing translations when they need one. But the real issue is the letter sequence. It's so awkward. It doesn't conform to any of the rules of Hebrew parallelism. It would be chiastic, which means there's a hinge point in the middle, but there's no Hebrew parallelism here either. I take it,
Mike, that if you could find the same code meaning in 2 different languages, that would give you some pause.
What do you mean by code meaning?
Code meaning. In other words, if you could come up with a code as significant as the 22 words and find that in 2 different translations, would that give you pause?
Well, if you could eliminate the 2- and 3-letter words from this is 22 letters.
If you came up with the same meanings in 2 different translations, 2 different languages.
All of the words in this sequence, and you can look at this if you go to my website, all of the words, there's 7 words, all of them have at least 2 of the most common Hebrew letters in them, except for Oz, that's only a 2-letter word. So
there is then the commonality.
Right. Well, any
common letters are common letters. You can't spell out anything without using the common letters.
Right. But the point is, as you yourself pointed out at the beginning, you can expect, at no odds greater than chance, that you can get certain 2 and 3, and you even said 4, letter words, meaningful, letter combinations that go into words. You can expect that by chance.
But not 22 letters. Well, that is what is astonishing. When you get
throw the 63 letters in there, you are using a rabbinic text. If you want to say that the rabbis divinely produced this code, I mean, I don't like that.
All right, gentlemen, I have an important question. I think if we took the Webster's Dictionary, or one of my books, or your book, Mike, the Bible Code Myth. That'd be a really good one to take. And we went a-searching. We went a-searching for meaningful phrases.
You'd probably get the.
Well, okay, the, sure.
You get other 3- and 4-letter words that were meaningful. But again...
But would we find a phrase like, Mike Heiser's eternal soul is in big trouble?
No, especially if you dump... Especially in the space of a third of a page, or about 7 verses long, if you dump 63 more letters into it, then you wouldn't get it.
But would we find meaningful phrases of...
Oh, sure.
Yes, oh yes?
And in the back of my book I have an appendix where mathematicians have done this. Again, it does include phrases, and it does include letters. This, from a statistical point of view, again, and Randall Ingermanson's book is the book for this. If you're a techie, okay, if you're a number cruncher kind of person, he says, and he should know, he's the computational physicist, that the hits that people are getting, okay, including this, because the letters in here are so small. And you get to divide them up, how you want, and all that stuff. But most of them are so small that the hits are not beyond chance.
Well, couldn't that be established by looking at another book or a series of books?
I would think so. I mean, somebody's going to have to
Grant, in support.
Time to reproduce
all right. Grant, in support of the Bible Code, has that been tried?
They have tried. They've tried it out. Interestingly
Who
enough,
are they?
Art. Well, people like Brandon McKay and that have tried it. And they have found that the best they found anywhere was 7 words dealing with Hanukkah. And that was, at least on what has been published that I have seen, no one has ever found any more than that. And that just doesn't compare, that compares like an apple to an orchard compared to what has been discovered.
Mathematically, it would be an apple to an orchard, I guess.
Like, just for example, in Isaiah 52 and 53, that almost all scholars, certainly Christian scholars, admit is a prophecy of the Messiah. Here's what we find, aside from that incredible long 22-letter one, you have Nazarene, Messiah, Shiloh, Passover, Galilee, Herod, Caesar, Caiaphas, Annas, the other high priest. 3 Marys, and there are, of course, 3 Marys at the crucifixion. The word disciples, Peter, Matthew, John, Andrew, Philip, Thomas, James, 2nd James, Simon, Matthias. The phrase, let him be crucified.
How about Arthur or Harry or Mike or Grant?
We didn't look for those.
Well, we did look for some of them. We didn't find those. We did do some random things searching. Most of this was actually discovered not by computer. I verified it with computer, but most of that particular one, Isaiah 53, was discovered by Yaakov Ramsel just manually looking at the thing. He doesn't even use the computer.
All right, gentlemen, listen, we're at the bottom of the hour here. We'll pick up when we get back. Now, Grant Jeffrey has written 17 books, and to be fair, I want to give Grant an opportunity to plug the book of his choice, or all 17 if you would like. What book, Grant, would you most like to have my listeners read?
Well, I think The Signature of God, which deals with the Bible code, and other indications of the supernatural origin of the Bible, medical statements in the Bible, over 100 that are literally thousands of years in advance of their time. But there are 3 chapters that deal with the Bible code phenomena. In fact, this was the first book in the English-speaking world that as far as I know, to really discuss the Bible code about a year before Drosden's book came out. And they can get it by going to the website, grantjeffrey.com. And they can see all the various books that I've done.
All right. You gentlemen have one segment left, so bring out your big guns and go wherever you want to go.
Well, there's a real interesting factor that really puzzled me when I first began looking at this, because I'm a skeptic. And I wondered why in the world there would be a code in the Bible at all. And
sure.
It struck me in my research that there actually is another code that is acknowledged by most Bible commentators. And it's found in Jeremiah chapter 51, verse 41, and also in Jeremiah 25, verse 26. And here's what it reads. How is Sheshach taken, and how is the praise of the whole earth surprised? How has Babylon become an astonishment among the nations? Well, the commentators realize and quote the fact that Sheshach is actually a cryptogram, a code, where if it was in English, A becomes Z, B becomes Y. You reverse the letters of the alphabet, and Sheshach actually translates into Babylon. And it appears that in the book of Jeremiah, in 2 different places, there's actually this code. They called it, they used the word Atbash, and the Jewish Talmud talks about these kind of strange codes that exist. Even in the New Testament, you have something that's somewhat similar in that the mark of the beast is going to be 666, the number of his name. And so it is intriguing, and it at least sort of gives you a context. So the Bible code phenomenon may not be that strange.
Yeah, so in other words, you're saying the Bible code is not by itself, that there are codes throughout. Mike?
Well, I would reference your listeners to go up to the website and about the 41 encoded names and hits that Grant is talking about.
Good for people with computers.
Good for people with computers, but again, just so it's really there so people know I'm not making it up. You can go visually look at it.
Sure.
Or get the book. This is the kind of thing that's in the book. What Grant is describing is a whole lot different than ELS sequencing. You know, you take the name of or the list of names here, the 41. If you delete the ones that we would both consider accidental, the short ones, you chop off 10, you're left with 31. Then you get to the problem of spelling of the names. Again, this is all cataloged up there. For instance, I think this might be a typo actually in Grant's book, but I do list here. Herod, for some reason, he has the O vowel in the wrong place, but there's a problem with the spelling of Herod. There's a problem with the spelling of Caiaphas. Peter, he's using the Aramaic, Kephah. In Aramaic, that's actually spelled completely differently, 2-letter differences. I go through every name, and once you weed out the spelling problems, you're left with 25. And then you get to what I call vocabulary problems, where, sometimes it's biblical Hebrew vocabulary that's used for a hit. Other times it's modern Hebrew, and I think you need to be consistent. There are words like for cross, talav, which does not even occur in the Hebrew Bible. It's a completely modern word. You delete those, and you're down to 20, and then you're left with a very short list. You got half the list left, and if you look at all the words there, every one of those words except one has at least 2 of the most common letters in the Hebrew alphabet. So I think it's far less spectacular than what is being conveyed here. I think you have to be consistent. You got to be upfront. What are we looking for? What language are we using? What spelling are we using? All that kind of thing. I guess if I could have one last question of Grant, why is Grant not using the text that is closest to the time of inspiration, the Dead Sea Scroll text? Because if you use that text, all the work that's been done in codes I think is just obliterated because of these dramatic, very dramatic letter differences. And I haven't even gotten to the notes that the scribes left themselves.
All right, good question. Would you agree it is the closest text to the time?
To the inspiration event.
The inspiration.
Closest in time, yes, but certainly many Bible scholars would not agree that the Dead Sea Scroll text is always to be preferred to any other text. The Orthodox Jews, in fact Jews throughout the world who use the Jewish scriptures, they use the Masoretic text that is used by virtually all the Bible code researchers, without exception, and most of them would find I think they would find it kind of a puzzling argument that Michael uses, because they believe that the text that they use in their Bibles is the inspired Word of God, and this was certainly until 1947 in the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I think virtually all Christian scholars would have said that the text that was used by the King James and subsequent, they felt that was the inspired Word of God.
How many of those scholars would say that now?
Well, I think that most would still say that the text we have is the inspired, and as Michael said, most of the differences are spelling differences. But because there are variants among the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves for the same passage, to take the kind of position as it's almost implied, but I don't think Michael would say this, that the particular Dead Sea Scroll variants or manuscripts, they're the absolute perfect.
No,
I don't think he would say that.
Here's what I would say.
The approach.
Here's what I would say. If the code is put into the text by God, and God had the prophet write, okay, the Dead Sea Scroll material is the way the prophets wrote. This is an archaeological fact. It is a scientific fact. These manuscripts are real. You can go to museums. They won't let you touch them, but you can see them. This is the material that most closely resembles what the prophets produced.
May I ask you a question?
Okay, and if it's given by God, why are we saying the rabbis are better spellers?
All right, may I ask a question, please? If we're debating here about the fact that the Dead Sea Scrolls should have been used, what happens when you use them?
Well, nobody's done that.
That's right. To my knowledge, none of the Israeli researchers have done it. They're certainly aware of it. They're in Jerusalem.
Wouldn't that help settle your argument?
I think it would be interesting to have it done.
Yeah, if there was a scientific... Let me just be clear here. I'm not opposed inherently. I try not to put the words God and can't in too many sentences, all right? Juxtaposed. I'm not opposed inherently to the idea that God could have done something like this, like Grant is describing. Okay, but the Dead Sea Scrolls are just one aspect. The scribes themselves, let me use one of the examples in the book. There are 33 letters in the Torah. This is in the first 5 books. But the scribes themselves who produced the Masoretic text, who took out the consonants I'm arguing about, and they put dots over the letters. Okay, those dots signified that letter was suspect and should be erased. Okay, there's another place where there are thousands. Some scholars say 1,800, others say a little bit lower, of letters that are confused because they look similar. The scribes noted this. They're aware of it. They're constantly aware of it. They produce notes. They produce reams of material telling us that the people who do Bible code research don't incorporate any of this. I mean, nothing, nada. Okay, they just use the modern Masoretic text, which was developed during the Middle Ages, 1,000 or more years removed from the event of inspiration. And my argument is if the code is from God, you use the text that the prophets produced.
I do believe that there are Bible code researchers that use the BHS. And what is interesting is...
That's a modern text built on the medieval work of the Masoretes.
Mm-hmm. But it's a variant from the Masoretic text used by the Jews in their Bible. And what is interesting is that they find that there are codes, but there are less codes per section, where, let's say, they find 12 codes about Hitler and the Holocaust. In the Masoretic text, they find maybe 8 in the BHS. And we've talked a lot about Isaiah 53, but just so our listeners get an example of some other types of codes that are fascinating, one of the most interesting ones statistically, and by the way, anyone's interested on the Internet, go to Bible Code Critic and take a look at the Holocaust codes in Deuteronomy chapter 8 to 12. I talked about them in my book, and here's what they found initially. They found the name Hitler, every 22 letters, Auschwitz, Belsen, another death camp, Berlin, King of the Nazis, Levi, an evil house rose up, Eichmann, and a people cry murder and slaughter. And there's a whole lot more they found that particular Internet site goes into it, and also a statistical analysis. I think you'd find it fascinating.
And I would say the same criticism applies. You take those passages, look at the Septuagint, look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, look at the scribal notations there. Work on the text, put the letters.
Much less variance though than in your Isaiah passage.
Well, you haven't looked. I mean, you were guessing, and to be fair, I didn't get this anywhere. I just did this in preparation for the show, so I'm not saying it's out there anywhere to find. But since the spelling practices are the same, the material comes from Qumran. They're going to spell consistently. I mean, we've had 50 years to study the Dead Sea Scrolls, and Malachi Martin's dissertation was on scribal practices, Art. Mm-hmm. This is a known fact. This is how they spelled. Okay, they're a word, this is how they did it. British English to our English. It's the same kind of phenomena going on. It's everywhere in the Hebrew Bible, no matter where it is. I don't care if it's in Deuteronomy or Isaiah 53. This is how they did it. And I still don't think I've received a satisfactory answer from Grant that if the code is divine, why are we preferring a medieval text, medieval spelling, as opposed to what the prophets actually produced?
Well, the fact of the matter is the research that has been done is on the Masoretic text, and it has found codes that, according to some of the mathematicians, the long ones, like the 22-letter one, are of such improbability that it's billions to one against it happening by chance. And so the question, there's lots of questions about Bible codes. I don't think anyone's got all the answers at all. But the question is, if the Masoretic text is faulty because of spelling changes,
in terms of
why would such statistically impossible almost codes be found?
May I interject?
Maybe they're in both. Maybe they're in the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's the next text.
If God is the infallible that we believe him to be, then would he not know ahead of time what languages we would use, what changes we would make, and where exactly we would be in the year 2001?
Obviously.
In terms of his intellectual capabilities, of course.
Well, in terms of how we would have changed things, or how the inspired word would have been changed for little letters here or there.
Right.
God would know all this, and the code would be intact.
I would say the answer to your question is of course God knows. The problem is that we are not omniscient. How do we know which manuscripts to use? How do we know whether we should use a mixture of Dead Sea Scroll material with later material? How should we know if we should use the Septuagint text?
No, my argument was that he would know what we would use.
He would know.
Yes.
But why hasn't he given us the list? Okay, here are the list of manuscripts that accurately produce the letter chain.
Right.
Why hasn't he told us? The problem is we're not omniscient. And to establish a secure letter sequence for the sake of a code, it requires omniscience to be sure that what you're looking at is the right data set.
Well, the Bible does, have phrases such as that not one jot or tittle of the word of the law.
That doesn't pertain to a code, Grant, and you know that.
I'm not talking about code. I'm just saying that God has affirmed in numerous ways that all Scripture is inspired, given by inspiration, that there are verses which strongly imply God's preservation, not only inspiration, but preservation.
Then why do we have manuscript differences?
Well, obviously, you get spelling differences.
Spelling differences.
But I believe
what about actual manuscript differences? For instance, the book of Jeremiah is probably the most dramatic example. The Septuagint of the book of Jeremiah is 1/7 shorter than the Masoretic text.
Right.
Now, how do we know whether the Masoretic text is too long or the Septuagint is too short? The answer is we don't. And if you're talking about Jeremiah, which is 52 chapters long, 1/7 of that book, that is hundreds of verses and thousands, if not tens of thousands of letters difference.
But that
how do we know that?
That only affects Bible codes which are within that area or depend on skipping over that area.
It would affect meaning if it's 1/7 difference. Now, I picked the most dramatic example, and quite frankly, nobody knows what to do with that problem because we're not omniscient. We don't know whether the Septuagint reflects the accurate text or the Masoretic text does. I mean, in that place, it's a conundrum, because there's such a wide, difference there. Most of the time, it's just a word or two. So who cares? There are differences like this that are real, and this is what textual critics do. And Bible-believing textual critics wrestle with these problems and try to come up with the best solution, that is faithful to a doctrine of preservation.
How does the Dead Sea Scroll?
That's the most difficult example.
How does the Dead Sea Scroll Jeremiah manuscript compare with the Septuagint?
Most of the time, this is a generalization now. Most of the time, the Dead Sea Scroll material agrees with the Septuagint. Okay, obviously, I just said most of the time. For instance, in Isaiah 53, though, I think the Masoretic text, where it disagrees with the Septuagint, I would, go with the Masoretic readings on just text-critical study principles. But just as a generalization, most of the time the Septuagint will side with the Dead Sea Scroll material. And there are places in Samuel that were complete gibberish, in the Masoretic text, and people had to guess, what the meanings were. And then when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, they validated the Septuagint readings, and translators were able to, put that in and produce better translations. And, I kidded a while ago about there being too many English translations. Actually, this is a worthwhile work because people are just struggling with this, and Bible believers are really trying to make the best effort possible to produce the most accurate text in terms of meaning that they possibly can. And these guys are committed. Some of them devote their whole lives to this.
Gentlemen, I have a question, and that is as follows. You said that the Bible originates from the inspired Word of God, received by perhaps many, right?
40-some guys, yeah.
40, all right, yeah. I get letters in the mail all the time, and email, that purports to be the inspired Word of God. Laugh as you will.
None of them have my name on it, Art.
Indeed, but why shouldn't we wonder about the original inspiration? Why should we even have faith that it's other than something that's very, very old and has been passed down? How do we know it's inspired by anything?
Well, there's a number of answers to that. One of the ones that I would give and gave in my book, Signature of God, is that if God, as a supernatural being, was the inspirer and ultimate author of the Bible, you would expect that it would bear his signatures, that there would be something about it that couldn't have been produced by normal human beings.
Right.
And what I argue in the book is that there are a number of things. For example, there are hundreds of detailed prophecies made in the Bible that have come true centuries after they were made with absolute precision.
Mike, I take it you would agree with that.
Yeah.
Then we are going to end then, gentlemen, on a note of agreement. I want to thank you both for being here tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you, Grant, too.
Thank you, Mike. Enjoyed it.